Welcome to State of the State. I'm Darlene DeRezzo, and I'm in conversation with Richard August. Dick is a longtime host of State of the State, and tonight we thought it'd be fun to have him in the guest chair. Welcome.
Well, I certainly hope it is fun. Very nice being here with you, Darlene.
We've
been crossing paths. You've been doing the one part, and I've been leaving as you come in. So
it's nice to sit down with you. Yes. You've actually sat in the guest chair before.
Yes, I have.
Yeah. So tonight I thought we'd talk about politics on the national and local level. And, you know, let me learn, or let's talk a little bit about you. So how long have you been doing this show?
I think it's been over 12 years, maybe more.
Okay. Do you have any memorable guests or experiences?
Heck yes. We've had some very interesting guests. I will have to say, Darlene, that it's becoming a little bit more difficult to get some guests because it almost seems like some of our elected leaders want to come on and know what all the questions are, and they want to be prepared. It's not so much that they are aware of that, but their handlers, their communications people, their press people are very concerned about what kind of image they're going to project. And so it's a little more difficult. When I first started many years ago, a lot of politicians wanted to come on, or elected officials, just to be able to talk to the public, the constituents. So it's changed a little bit.
Yeah, that's sad to hear. Yeah. All right. So where do you want to start? Do you want to start with, well, our recent election in 2024?
Well, we can start there because, you know, we are in President Trump's 2.0, his first 100 days of his second term. And he certainly has gone around and he's made tremendous moves in all directions, both domestically and internationally, economically and otherwise. And he's almost like trying to get as much done as he can, because I think he realizes that although he's got 4 years, that for all intents and purposes, he's got about 18 months to get his agenda or some of it passed. And I say 18 months because at that point, we're going to be looking at the congressional elections for 2026. And the attention is going to shift to that. And depending on how successful his initiatives are, it will determine largely whether the Republicans are going to keep control of the Senate. Now, he's not going anywhere for 2 more years. But for most presidents, when they get into the second term, if they're running consecutively, by the time they get halfway through, they're considered lame ducks anyway, because they can't rerun. So run again for election. So I think he knows he has a limited amount of time, and he's trying to cover as much ground as possible.
Okay, and that is certainly hard for a lot of people.
Sure, because he's trying to do a lot of changing and getting the country back away from what I'm going to call the Biden year and also Barack Obama. Many people are talking about Biden as being Barack Obama's third term, because it was pretty clear, it's becoming actually clear to most people, that Joe Biden was not in control of all his mental faculties for a good part of his term, maybe all of it, who knows. The woman whose name is Lucy Lee, who was a major Democrat Party fundraiser, and very much on the inside, has now come out and she's talking about how people have asked who was running the country if Biden wasn't running it. And she has named, and I'm trying, so I don't forget anyone, she's named a number of people that she called his gatekeepers. The first of which was obviously his wife, Jill. And Jill was very much determined to keep that power and status of First Lady. There was a gentleman named Steve Buscemi, a woman named Anita Dunn, Mike Donnelly, Bob Bauer, and Ron Klein. Ron Klein, I think, was his chief of staff. And she has really talked about how these people were really controlling pretty much what was going on. And actually, it was kind of disturbing because Hunter Biden, who had no security clearance, was actually sitting in on high-level briefings and making decisions in the last few years of that term. I don't think it's going to happen with Donald Trump. Obviously, his personality is a lot different. His mental faculties are much better. But even here, Darlene, Donald Trump has basically got the cabinet and department heads and key people in place that he wants. And I think most of them, if you look at the whole roster, these are people that supported him, for the most part, very vigorously. The question being raised is, how qualified are these people for some of the jobs they're in?
Okay.
But for really all intents and purposes, there are two key people working with Donald Trump. One is Elon Musk, who most people are aware of, I think is in charge of domestic affairs. Trump agrees with what he's trying to do, and a lot of people do, but many people are very concerned that we didn't elect Elon Musk. But I would point them back to Franklin D. Roosevelt, who did serve he was elected 4 times. He died in his 4th term. But he had a gentleman named Harry Hopkins that most people our age wouldn't recognize the name. But Harry Hopkins was not an elected official, but he was, in fact, acknowledged. When he spoke, they know he was speaking for Franklin D. Roosevelt internationally. He was sent all over the place. And the fellow who was in charge of foreign affairs is a gentleman named Steve Witkoff. Steve Witkoff has no experience in diplomacy. He is a New York City real estate lawyer. He owns a golf course. He and Donald Trump are golfing buddies. And their relationship goes back quite a ways. If you look at Marco Rubio, who Trump named as the Secretary of State, and you remember his nickname for Rubio was Little Marco, the derogatory term that he used when Rubio was running for president against him. Marco Rubio doesn't look like a very happy Secretary of State, because this Steve Witkoff is the one who's running all the negotiations in the Middle East. He's getting involved in Ukraine, and Rubio's being shortchanged or kind of let out of the picture. There's another gentleman named Kellogg, former lieutenant general, who again has some background, but he's really running the negotiations with regard to Ukraine. And this Secretary of State is, along with Secretary of Defense and maybe Secretary of Treasury, are the 3 most important cabinet positions. Rubio is not happy. If you look at him in press conferences and so forth, there was the scene with Trump and baby Netanyahu in front of the fireplace, and on the bench you had Rubio, Hegseth, who's the Secretary of Defense, and then Waltz, who's the National Security Advisor, were kind of on the side bench opposite their Israeli counterparts. It's hard to figure out what's going on, and I think sometimes internationally there's some signal calling that gets misinterpreted. Witkoff will be saying one thing, Clark Kellogg will say another thing. Marco Rubio comes out and says something else again. So it's not a good picture, because they have too many people calling signals. And I don't know, it's going to be an interesting thing. Domestically, of course, there's a lot of balls in the air. The big, beautiful tax cut he wants, the impact of tariffs.
Yeah, so there's a lot of talk right now about tariffs.
Yes.
Can you expand on that?
Yes, well, I think at first I thought this was crazy, because we went through this once before in our history, during what people say led to the Great Depression, or an extension of it. But I'm almost now coming around now to the opinion that this is Trump negotiating style. What he's done is forced a lot of countries, especially the European Union countries, coming individually now to negotiate with his advisors. Taiwan recently removed all tariffs, and he counts that as a great victory. So we will see what the effect is, and whether or not there are going to be concessions made on both sides to lessen the impact of this. But people have to realize about 90% of our prescription medications come from China. So if China really wants to get nasty and they say, well, we're not sending you any more prescriptions, what are we going to do? Well, we don't have the facility to make them here. And so that's...
Well, do you think he is wanting the facilities here then?
Well,
I mean, is
that would be the ideal. Sure, that's what his goal is.
Yeah, speak a little bit about his negotiation style.
Yep. Well, he's the author of Art of the Deal, as you know. But negotiations in business are a little bit different than negotiating between countries. The United States is regarded as the most powerful economy with the most powerful military, at least that seems to be the case. So he has a lot of bargaining chips to work with. I think when he points to the jobs we want to bring back, a lot of those jobs, especially in automotive, have been building machines are building the cars in China. There's not assembly lines with 1,000 people anymore. There might be 50 people, and the rest are robots. So yes, we can bring those back. And if you notice, the Ford Motor Company commercials on television, most recent ones actually show the fact Ford builds its cars and trucks here, and it shows the people on the assembly line and everything. And then you look at companies like Chrysler, for example, almost all their stuff is manufactured elsewhere, maybe assembled in the United States. Mm-hmm. So, but if you look at the Ford production line, you still see a lot of robots. You don't see a lot of people like there used to be. Mm-hmm. So a lot of these jobs are going to disappear anyway. And we all should be aware that AI or artificial intelligence is going to have a major impact on the jobs that we have. If you go to the supermarket today and you see all the checkout counters, I remember when Stop and Shop first put the little robot going up and down the mm-hmm. aisles, and they told all the employees that all it was looking for was spills. Well, if you go to, for example, I went to BJ's the other day, in their warehouse, their little robot's going around, and it's actually announcing, it has a sign right on it, I'm checking inventory levels.
Wow.
So what's going to happen eventually, rather than people going around checking the stock, the robot does it, and he's going to communicate with a robot in the back that's going to go and pick the thing puts it out on the shelf. And another robot is going to send a message to the distribution center, and they're going to bring it, this is what's going to happen.
Well, what's going to happen to the people that need those jobs?
Well, you know what? We've gone through this before.
Okay,
when the Industrial Revolution that began in Rhode Island started, mm-hmm. there was a big uproar. Machines are going to take over. And people would come to this country with no skills at all, and they would go to work, put it on the railroad, banging spikes into the track, or mm-hmm. they'd go and dig trenches, mm-hmm. the ditch digging basically, mm-hmm. or working on the roads by hand. Today, what do you see? Mostly machines doing that heavy work, and there's the skilled machine operators doing it, but we don't have the big, huge crews that we once had working on the railroad and on the roads. So the same thing is going to happen in industry. It's an unfortunate trend, but a lot of these semi-skilled jobs are not going to be available.
Okay.
Sorry, folks.
That's not good
but
news.
But if you go, well, it's not good news for people who don't have the skills mm-hmm. Or the inclination to want to learn those skills.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think Canada is going to become the 51st state.
Which one? Canada? Canada, no, because Canada, although it has a large area, has a much smaller population.
40 million.
40 million. Most of it is in the eastern part. It's a provincial federation, so it's an entirely different system of government. They have a parliamentary system as opposed to our system. The eastern part of the country, the province of Quebec, has tried several times to break away independently. And when they found out that once they wanted to break away, but they wanted all the debt that they had incurred through the Federation forgiven, and they wanted to continue to use Canadian currency. Well, that's why it would fail. To say we want to bring them in as the 51st state would mean there'd be 2 senators and how many Congress people and representatives. And since most of the population is in the eastern part, which has more left-leaning tendencies, you'd end up with a lot more Democrats in Congress as a result of them being the 51st state. So I don't think it's going to happen, but who knows?
Well, what about Greenland becoming a U.S. territory?
Well, that's even more interesting because as Greenland is the largest island in the world. It's in the Arctic Circle. The population is less than 57,000 on this gigantic island.
Unbelievable.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the most recent information I just watched this morning, it's a poll said 75% of those people do not want to be a territory in the United States. Denmark, of course, is screaming bloody murder. They consider it their territory. It has been historically their territory.
For some
probably
time.
mostly because the Vikings settled it or explored it. And it did have settlements there. My understanding is that President Trump is very serious about this, and he has ordered various government agencies to begin a campaign on social media to influence the Icelanders, or Greenlanders, I guess is what they're called, Greenlanders, to influence them to want to be supportive and to encourage their support. There is a plan afoot to give each person in Greenland $10,000 a year as an incentive if they become a U.S. territory. So we see that this is a vast area. There's supposedly tremendous natural resources. And this is what I think Donald Trump is looking at. But the question is, if the United States does annex it or that becomes a territory, who's going to develop these resources? Will the United States government do it, or are we going to turn it over to corporate America and say, okay, go up there and find out what we have? So I don't think it's going to happen, but I think there's somewhat of a determination on the part of President Trump to try to make it happen. He's talked about it before in the past, I think.
Okay. So want to move on to Russia and Ukraine?
Well, Ukraine.
Has a big sigh there, Dick.
Well, I've been, people who have watched this program, when John and I have discussed this, I take sort of a contrarian view because I do not listen to for the most part, the United States media for my information. I try to find either foreign sources or sources from academia or recognized experts in foreign policy. Donald Trump said he was going to end the Ukraine war in one day upon taking office. Well, his administration has the authority to cease sending any more arms to Ukraine. He hasn't done it. Now, when the funding runs out, there's not going to be any.
Well, let me pause you there.
Sure.
Why hasn't he done it?
That's a very good question.
Okay.
So, as I said, there's two characters at play here. Keith Kellogg, Lieutenant General former, Keith Kellogg and Steve Witkoff are like at odds about what's going to be done. Vladimir Zelensky is trying to be a player, but he has really nothing to say about it. First thing people have to realize is Vladimir Zelensky suspended the national elections a year ago, March.
Do you think he's a legitimate president?
Well, he's not a legitimate president. He declared martial law, and apparently under their constitution, that would allow him to suspend these elections because he knew he was going to lose. We have sent, under the Biden administration, I think $200 billion of aid of various types. Unfortunately, some of the weapons that we sent are turning up in gangs in South America.
So how did the weapons go from the U.S. to Ukraine to...
Ukraine was regarded and has been identified as one of the most, probably the most corrupt government in Europe before all this happened. So they just put it on the black market, and under the Biden administration, there was no accountability required. And so they don't know where a lot of this stuff is ending up. And it's also being found in the Hamas and Hezbollah. Some of the weapons that are being captured are ours.
And how were they identified as ours?
The serial numbers.
Okay. Are those manufactured in the U.S.?
Yes, most of them. Colt, most of those would be manufactured by companies like Colt, would be the primary one in that case.
So weapons of war are manufactured in the United States?
Sure. Oh, that's our big defense industry, our defense industrial complex, which is very much in favor of these wars continuing because they're exhausting our stockpiles of these munitions, and they're going to have to be replaced. The problem is our industry is not on a war footing.
What does that mean?
It means that they're not prepared to sustain a combat type situation. In fact, I saw a report this morning that the United States Navy in the Persian Gulf has no more anti-missile missiles left. They've exhausted them, and there's no more in inventory.
Well, who have they fired them at? Who have they fired them at?
They were firing at the Houthis, who were firing at them because they were being attacked from American aircraft carriers. Oh. So they have, and some of they were trying to intercept missiles that were being fired at Israeli flagged ships that were in that area, excuse me, and they've exhausted their inventory, and there's nothing in the pipeline for them. They've got to be replaced. There's some schools of thought that say that we wanted to exhaust these because a lot of these munitions are obsolete or obsolescent. And again, the defense industrial complex is going, oh boy, now we can start building some new stuff. It's been announced that Boeing has been given the contract for the F-47 sixth generation fighter plane. And what's coming out of this is that it basically will be a computer platform with a man sitting in it. And AI is going to fly the plane and communicate with there'll be a fleet of drones that'll go up with this airplane. Some of them will be surveillance drones, some will be kamikaze drones that crash into the target, some will be there to jam radar so they can't be detected, and there's others that'll be, they drop the bombs, but it'll continue to fly. But they're all going to be controlled out of this one aircraft. Lord knows how much it's going to cost. But the man sitting in it is really superfluous. They don't really need him in there, but the Air Force obviously does not want to be the first putting an unmanned plane in that position.
Yeah.
That's just the Air Force side of it, but certainly the Army and the Marine, everybody's trying to modernize, but what Ukraine and actually to some extent what the conflict in Israel is showing us is that warfare has changed drastically. Right,
so from tanks in World War I to subs in World War II to now what?
Well, drones.
Drones, okay.
And artificially run, even ground vehicles. The Army is experimenting with having small vehicles that don't have any crew in them, but that can be controlled from a central spot. The Russians have shown that they have integrated their drone technology, their surveillance aircraft, their satellite aircraft, and their artillery, whether you're talking about rockets or the traditional artillery that's fired through a tube. They've integrated to this point where it's impossible to mass troops anymore. Or if you have a mass storage dump, they can be detected and wiped out in minutes. One of the problems the Army is facing, and actually all the services, is that their tactical operation centers that have to be fairly close, can be identified very easily by all the radar antennas and radio and just the signals they're sending out, and they can be wiped out again in minutes as soon as they're identified. So the whole idea of warfare has to undergo a serious change, and it's going to be a painful transition for sure.
Yeah. So what do you anticipate for Trump? Should he bring resolution to this conflict? What do you anticipate for Trump if he does bring resolution to this conflict?
I think Trump would like to end the war in Ukraine. He pledged he could do it, and I think he and Vladimir Putin are pretty much on the same wavelength. Now, one of the things that the Russians have made extremely clear is they have paid in blood and treasure for the area that they've taken in Ukraine. That area is ethnically Russian and Russian-speaking. When Ukraine was established, it was recognized that that area was basically ethnically Russian. But the Russians at that point allowed that to be part of Ukraine. The Russians have made it clear they're not giving it back. And in fact, they may even push further because Zelensky seems to think that he has some sort of a bargaining chip and he should have some say in what should be done. Russians are not going to roll back to the original borders. You've had Keith Kellogg has gone there and he's made some statements that would indicate that they should, but it's not going to happen. I mean, they're in the driver's seat. And I don't think anybody in the United States really wants to see United States troops fighting Russian troops in Ukraine. Ukraine is a very vast area, and it was supposed to be a neutral territory. But beginning with the Bill Clinton administration, he's the first one that began to talk about NATO moving closer and closer. The very polished and experienced foreign minister for Russia said yesterday or the day before, NATO should have ceased to exist when the Soviet USSR, Socialist Republic, broke up and the Warsaw Pact dissolved. That was the reason that NATO existed. Once that threat no longer existed, why did NATO continue? Because every bureaucracy wants to protect itself and expand itself if it can. And beginning with the Bill Clinton administration, going right through George W. Bush and into the Biden administration, and actually the first Trump administration, they kept pushing into closer and closer to the borders of Russia. And finally, Putin kept saying, enough. If you go into Ukraine, all bets are off. So they've taken the territory, they're not giving it back. So I think Clark Kellogg said something about, why don't we go make it like Berlin, divided city, and we'll have NATO troops in that western half. That's exactly what they said they weren't going to do. Putin and Russians will never allow NATO troops to be in Ukraine. They don't have to, and they're willing to, they see it as an existential threat. So
do you think Trump will be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize if he does bring
well,
resolution to this conflict?
if he keeps supporting what's going on in Israel and Gaza and Palestine.
Oh, well, let's move over to there. So we're traveling the world
yes,
tonight.
We are. And again, people have heard me talk about this, and I've had people contact me and say, well, where are you getting your information? I have a whole list of people that I can recite, but...
Would you?
Yeah. Okay. So I don't want to leave anybody else. I have it written down. Professor Jeffrey Sachs, Professor John Mersheimer, former British Ambassador Alistair Cook, Scott Ritter, UN Weapons Inspector, Colonel Douglas McGregor, who heads up a new group, Lieutenant Colonel Dan Davis, who was being considered to be Tulsi Gabbard's second in command until that was scuttled, former American Ambassador Charles Freeman, Larry Johnson, a former CIA analyst, Colonel Larry Wilkerson, Professor Gilbert Doctorow, Professor Glenn Dyson, and a gentleman named Max Blumenthal, who I believe is a dual American-Israeli citizen who has who reads the newspaper. All these people have contacts, are well-known in international communities. They have contacts all over the world, and they follow the foreign press, and they know what's going on. Right now in Israel's army is mostly all reserves. Many of them are refusing to report for duty because they do not want to be sent back into Gaza. The most recent analysis says, on an Israeli newspaper, is that there are at least 40,000 Hamas fighters left in Gaza. The Netanyahu government has to stay at war because otherwise it will be dissolved and Netanyahu will probably be put on trial for bribery. So he has a very real interest in making sure this war continues. Donald Trump, like Biden, could have ended the war by simply saying, we are not going to send you any more arms. You're going to stop because you're just getting out of control. They don't want to do that. And I think in the case of Donald Trump, he is one of his other key advisors is also a dual American Israeli citizen who most people will not recognize the name, Miriam Adelson, she's a medical doctor. She's worth about $34 billion.
Didn't she fund some of Trump's campaign? Isn't she a
There's
large donor?
There's a thing called the American Israeli Political Action Committee, which in Washington is often referred to as the Jewish lobby. Dr. Edelson spent $100 million on the last Trump campaign. And in 2020, I think she spent $950 million.
So do you think he's influenced by her?
Absolutely.
Okay.
She actually flies in her private jet. When Netanyahu meets with Trump, she's there in the room with them. And on Trump's inauguration, she was sitting right behind the First Lady on the dais. So she's a very powerful person that most people don't even know about. But Donald Trump has surrounded himself and his cabinet. Most of the people there are very much pro-Israel. And Mike Huckabee has just been sworn in as the ambassador. Mike Huckabee, of course, is a very devout Christian, but however, he is one of the fundamentalist Christians who believe that Jesus has to come back, he's going to have to come back to Jerusalem in the second coming, and that the Jewish people should control Jerusalem. There's again a little known thing that General Wesley Clark, who, if you recall, was the NATO commander when we had the whole situation in Bosnia, when he came to the Pentagon for a briefing, he was advised of a thing called the Israeli white paper known as Clean Break. And he's talked about this. That document identified the countries that Israel has identified as that should be part of the greater Israel. They include Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Iran, Somalia, Libya. And if you look at these countries, you'll see that we have influenced either the overthrow of the government or attacks primarily by Israel. We're fighting a proxy war through Israel, although we are engaged in an undeclared war because we are using B-2 bombers and Navy fighter bombers to attack the Houthis, who have been under bombardment for 10 years through our proxy. The Saudi Arabians have been bombing them for 10 years, and they're still fighting. So it's a very messy situation, but it could be brought to an end. But right now, the ultra-right Zionist part of the Likud party in the parliament, the Likud party is what Netanyahu heads up, so therefore he is the prime minister, is determined to create this greater Israel. And so they're not only fighting in Gaza, pretty much have destroyed it, but they're fighting on the West Bank, which is supposed to be Palestinian by the United Nations when they created Israel. They're now fighting and bombing in Syria, which was overthrown thanks to the CIA support of, guess what? ISIS. And they are, we obviously know what happened in Somalia, you know what happened in Libya. So yes, it's a very complicated thing. Most people are not aware of it, but it's a very real thing that's taking place. Well, Donald Trump could call an end to it, but I don't think he's going to qualify for the Nobel Peace Prize if we reach a peace agreement in Ukraine, and then you're continuing to expand the war in Israel, especially if they get us to fight a war with Iran. And that's not an outside chance that might happen, unfortunately.
Yeah, so you're frightened about that, or concerned?
Well, we know what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. Most military experts will say Iran will be 10 times worse because it's a larger population, their military is more sophisticated. Despite what a lot is being said about how we're knocking the Iranian military about, when Israel, first of all, when Iran sent that big shower of missiles and drones, most of them were drones, and they were basically to send a warning to Israel that we know where your areas are. Yes, a lot of them were shot down, but I believe it was 7 of the 9 ballistic missiles that Iran launched all hit their target in Israel. And luckily, they did not target any civilians. They targeted the airfield where the F-35 fighter planes, fighter bombers were taking off from, or were maintained. And that was their target. And all 6 or 7 of their missiles hit that target. But in response, you remember Israel sent a big aircraft headed by the F-35s. There's radio transmissions from F-35 pilots that are saying they've got us on radar. The F-35 is supposed to be invisible to radar, which means that the Russian-built air defense system that the Iranians had was tracking these fighter planes, which made them vulnerable. So the Israeli pilots dropped their bombs, or released their bombs far farther away than they were supposed to, because they didn't want to get in range of the ground, the surface-to-air missile.
Okay.
So this is not being reported. People say, well, I just gave you the whole list of people that I listened to. Why aren't we being told that by the American press?
That's a good question.
Because the American press is pretty much in the pocket of whatever the government wants them to say, unfortunately.
Okay. So locally and nationally, there are pro-Palestine rallies, right? So here locally, what do you make of that? What do you think? And they're on college campuses, right? So what do you think young people are thinking nowadays about what's happening there overseas?
Well, first of all, let me be very clear. I don't think any protest should bar a Jewish student from getting to class or getting to the library or whatever. That's not a peaceful protest. But our First Amendment certainly allows for peaceful protests. We've had protests that were less than peaceful in Providence, Rhode Island for Black Lives Matter, where police cars were burned and everything else. We kind of accepted those. Because a person is saying that they are not in favor of our policy toward Palestine or what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians, and some people argue, well, gee, Palestine isn't really a word that was used. Well, guess what? It was used during the Roman Empire. I have a Bible with a map of the Roman map, and they do refer to that area as Palestine. So it wasn't something that was made up 20 years ago or 50 years ago or whatever. But certainly, people have a right to protest that, just as we protested the Vietnam War. There were people that were protesting our war in Iraq fairly early on, if you recall, especially parents who had lost children there, and they were questioning, well, why are we there? Why did we go fight Iraq? Because the government told us, thanks to the CIA and the British MI6, that Saddam Hussein was working on weapons of mass destruction, primarily nuclear. Guess what we found? Nothing.
Nothing.
And yet we went to war, and it cost us tens of thousands of casualties, many killed, many wounded, many still suffering the effects of post-traumatic stress. And we found no weapons of mass destruction, yet everybody we were assured we were going to find them. We spent 20 years in Afghanistan, our longest war, and we defeated the Taliban. We left because President Biden wanted us out by the 20th anniversary, and guess who's in charge again? The Taliban. What did we accomplish with the 4,000 or 5,000 men and women who were killed and the tens of thousands that were wounded, and the billions of dollars that we left behind because of the hasty withdrawal? So that's what I say when people say, well, I'm not seeing this or hearing this on the United States media or American media. Well, then you have to ask yourself why. So that's, that's the valid question.
Yeah, and do you think young people are looking to alternative news sources?
Because I think there are certain people on college campuses that are trying to get that message out to them. I don't think a lot of the stuff that's being taught is necessarily correct because it amounts to revisionist history. But I think with respect to current events, we have to look at what's the other person, what's the other party's interest here. And we have to ask ourselves, what is the American interest in Ukraine? It's pretty clear what our interest is in Israel. I heard that about 75% of our medical instruments come from Israel. That's one economic part of it. But certainly the United States of America, which was the first country to recognize the state of Israel when it was created by the United Nations, feels a moral obligation to that country based on what happened during World War II. And basically the extermination of 6 million European Jews. But then people that are pro-Palestinian, so-called, doesn't mean they're anti-Semitic. It means what they're doing is looking at what Israel is doing with respect to the people in Gaza. And they don't really know how many people were killed because buildings, the rubble, there's probably tens of thousands of bodies in the buildings and the rubble that's there. We don't even know what's happening. But we do know that many foreign aid workers were targeted by Israeli forces, some of whom were Americans. There's video of these people, these convoys being attacked, being traced from where they were being offloaded with medical supplies, food, and medicine, and being tracked by the Israelis and being attacked by their attack helicopters. And some American aid workers in those convoys were killed. Does the American press really pursue that kind of a story? No. And most Americans forget about it very quickly.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's a tough situation. I go back to the Vietnam War, which was my era, and we had lost 58,000 men mostly. There was a dozen or so women nurses that were killed. But we lost 58,000, wounded probably 3 times that many, and then many more suffering the effects of that. It was based on something called the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which I remember reading about, where North Korean torpedo boats ostensibly attacked a couple of Navy destroyers. The truth has come out that that attack really never occurred. And that's what launched Lyndon Johnson's request for what's called the War Powers Act, which allows the United States president to go to war without a declaration by Congress. And that's where we are today. Are we not experiencing maybe the same thing when our president sends B-2 bombers to bomb a country that is, I don't know, 10,000 miles away and represents no threat to the United States? It's a question we have to ask ourselves, and I think these people that are protesting are asking that question. And it's an uncomfortable question.
It is. All right, well, let's talk about China.
Yes, China. China is...
And what happens if China invades Taiwan?
I don't think the United States military is prepared to fight China over Taiwan. I don't think we have the supply capability or we certainly can't fight a land war in Taiwan, which is a fairly large island. China may make overtures toward it, but China is building a large navy for a reason. And they're going to declare the South China Sea their territory. They're building artificial islands there already. And I think they certainly want to increase their influence all over the world. And people should remember that I think it's 30 or 40% of the oil that China uses comes from Iran. So what's going to happen if we start fighting and Iran can't deliver the oil to China? So China is a serious thing, and I think what's happening because of our foreign policy is we're driving China and Russia closer together, diplomatically and economically. Really? Yes, and that's a bad combination. So we have to really be careful. China, of course, is probably the second largest economy. As I said, they supply about 90% of our prescription medications. They certainly are a powerhouse because all you have to do is look at the tools you buy or the clothes you wear or the cars you drive, and you'll see that a lot of it is made in China.
And Taiwan.
are Taiwan. And Taiwan, of course, as I said, they've agreed to zero tariffs because we get a lot of our semiconductor chips from Taiwan. And so if China is able to control Taiwan, that's another way they've got a stranglehold on our economy. So we've got to be careful about that. And I understand Japan has just tested some sort of a super secret laser weapon that can penetrate, I don't know how many feet of steel. And they're working on a defensive system because they are getting concerned about China. And they're also concerned about Russia, which of course they've had conflict with in the past. So Japan is getting concerned about the overtures, the growth of China. The only thing we have going for us is that the Chinese form of government does not really lend itself to quick action. So we'll have to just keep our fingers crossed.
Yeah. What about the 28,000 troops over there in South Korea? So why do you suppose they're still there?
It's a very good question,
70
Darlene.
years after.
I've asked myself many times.
Okay, so 70 years after a ceasefire was declared.
Right.
Okay.
And South Korea certainly is a vibrant economy. It has a pretty good military force. It could certainly defend itself. And of course, North Korea is also kind of a wild card. And
why do you say that?
Because there's a somewhat psychologically unbalanced person in charge.
Okay.
And he's the third generation of his family that's been in charge.
Okay.
You recall that Trump actually met with him.
I do. Yeah.
And at that point, North Korea stopped its rattling of its nuclear capabilities and its missiles. Well, it's resurrected them again. So China should exercise some control over them. Hopefully they will, but hey, if they get together more and more, certainly if you get Russia, China, and North Korea together, you've got a bad situation in terms of the amount of military force and power, and they're all nuclear armed, nuclear capable countries. By the way, people should realize that when Iran is talking about, even if people say that Iran is building nuclear weapons, the fact of the matter is, I think it's the CIA issued a report that they have not worked on a nuclear weapon since, I think it was I forget whether it was 2007 or 2017. They haven't worked on them. So the nuclear stuff, the uranium they're enriching is supposedly for power, not for weapons. Not to say they can't convert very quickly. And Israel has a nuclear weapon. They are a nuclear power, even though they're not acknowledged as one, because it's well known in diplomatic circles that when South Africa stopped the nuclear program, they gave all that technology to Israel, and Israel does have a nuclear capability. So when people start worrying about Iran, you kind of have to worry, what would be Israel's intentions? Why are they nuclear armed?
So we've traveled the world.
We have traveled the world. We haven't even talked about local politics.
Let's do that. We have a few minutes left.
I have a few minutes
Where do
left.
you want to start? Any comments on local politics?
Yes, I have a couple.
Okay.
I saw our Representative Seth Magaziner was on Channel 12 with the investigative reporters. People might recall that going into the election, he was on Channel 12, and they pointed out that he does not live in the district.
Interesting.
And that is not illegal
Okay.
under the federal law.
Okay.
That's okay. But he said that he and his wife had purchased a house in North Kingstown, which would put him in the 2nd Congressional District. 2nd District. Well, Channel 12 pointed out that he still hasn't moved. And so he was interviewed, and he said, well, his wife now has a job in Massachusetts, and it's a long commute, and their house that they bought in North Kingstown needs a lot of repairs, and they really can't find the contractors to do it. And he has really, what he's saying, I have no intention of moving to North Kingstown. Speculation is he's not going to run for another term in Congress.
Okay.
So the interesting thing is, Would the Republicans find somebody that would be a viable candidate for that seat? Who knows?
What do you make of the Republican Party in Rhode Island now?
It's not much of a party. I think it's kind of just sitting there like a shadowy image somewhere. We've had, as you know, on this program, we had the minority leader of both the House and the Senate, Rep. Chippendale and Senator De La Cruz came on, and they go anywhere and talk about, you know, the situation. But the fact of the matter is the Republican Party is kind of there, but unless they can form a coalition with some dissatisfied Democrats in the legislature, they don't really have any power. And if you look at I'm going to throw a guess out there that people are maybe shocked. I don't even think the Republicans are going to be able to find someone to run for governor this time.
Yeah. So last time we had someone come in from out of state.
She
right?
came from out of state. She had an interest here, and she poured $5 million of her own money into the campaign.
Yeah.
But she was, as soon as that happened, they obviously labeled her as an outsider. Yeah, she bought a house in Newport and all this other stuff. But they were lucky to find someone who had $5 million to throw into it because of a grudge match with McKee over the whole COVID vaccination thing that was going on. So, COVID testing, I should say. So they did find somebody. I don't know who they'd find in the wings to do it again. The Republican Party, again, is hard-pressed. They don't have much money. Very often, I see people who will, well, a good example, Speaker Nicholas Mattiello was defeated when he ran against Alan Fung's wife. And he was the most powerful guy there. He was able to be defeated. She went into the legislature as a Republican, and my understanding is they called for a caucus, and she walked in and she said, I'm just here to represent my district. I'm not going to caucus with you people. How can you be a political force? You don't think any Democrat would walk into the Speaker's office for a caucus and say, I'm not coming to this. Not going to happen.
So do you think Governor McKee will get the nomination?
I'd say it's iffy at this point because he's got some strong competition. Helena Foulkes ran a good campaign. She's intelligent, articulate. She has money behind her, and he could have trouble with her for sure. There are rumors around that Speaker Sakarchi may be entertaining a run, and he has a big war chest already accumulated. So if they have a primary, especially a three-way primary, I'm not sure that Governor McKee will survive a three-way primary, or maybe even two-way. Okay.
We have 5 minutes.
We do?
Yes, well, what else?
Let's talk about some other things. How about your favorite topic?
My favorite topic?
Yes, Second Amendment. You always want to talk to people about yes, that's one of your favorite.
A very interesting show. I had a very interesting show with Brenda Jacob and oh gosh, I'm blanking at the moment. But talking about gun rights as women's rights, which was a very interesting show.
Yes, it was.
Yeah. So what do you have to say about Rhode Island and where we're at with the Second Amendment?
Okay. Well.
And gun control.
Yeah. Well, we know all the general officers. We had Greg Amore on, as you know. I interviewed him. He's come out with all the general officers in support of the assault weapon ban, including the governor who's come out very strongly for it. I think it's a very high probability that it will pass. However, the United States Supreme Court is considering, it's going to reach a decision on a case called Snopes versus Moore or something like that. It's a case that came out of Maryland that deals with the constitutionality of banning assault weapons as a class of firearms. Depending on that decision, anything Rhode Island does could be moot, because if the Supreme Court says you cannot ban a whole class of firearms, that's out of the picture.
And it's my understanding that this class of firearms has not actually been defined.
It's not clearly defined.
Not clearly defined,
right.
Yeah.
The other case that this
And why isn't this a war on crime?
Well,
right, because ultimately, isn't that what this is about?
Well, that's what the argument is, that we're going to be safer if we don't have this. Now, only a very few states have an assault weapon ban.
Are they safer? Are they safer? Do you know?
They would argue that they are, but who knows? I mean, statistics can be used to prove anything. But the other case the Supreme Court is looking at is actually a Rhode Island case called Ocean State Tactical versus Rhode Island.
Interesting, okay.
So that has to do with the high-capacity magazine ban that was passed a couple of years ago. You recall that all magazines holding more than 10 bullets had to be surrendered to the police, sold, or disposed of, or whatever.
Or
blocked.
Tweaked in some way,
Yes,
yeah.
you can block them. So this case actually is kind of unusual because the Supreme Court is going to decide whether or not, hopefully they'll hear this case, whether or not the First District Judge, McConnell, who handed down, would not temporarily enjoin the state from enforcing that ban. So it wasn't even a full trial. It was a case the gun control, the Second Amendment community filed for an injunction temporary so that an argument can be heard whether or not that was a constitutional law, you know. He wrote a very long opinion that basically said, no, I'm not giving you a temporary injunction. So that is what the Supreme Court is being asked to look at, is his ruling. Now, if that gets overturned, I don't think it automatically means that the high-capacity magazine ban goes away. Snopes may do that because I think his case encompasses not only what the firearm is, but whether or not a magazine is a part of the firearm and so forth. So these two cases are very important, and it could clarify this whole situation surrounding assault weapons. The question I always ask is how many people in Rhode Island have been killed with an assault weapon?
How many?
I don't think anybody knows, and I don't think it's if they don't know, then it's not very many.
Okay.
You'll see the police.
Do we know how many firearms are in the hands of citizens, civilians versus criminals in Rhode Island? Do we know how many?
No, because the Rhode Island Constitution specifically prohibits the state keeping a registry of firearms.
Oh, okay.
So this bill, this assault weapons ban, requires the registration of if you own an assault weapon, you have a year to register it with the police and pay a $25 permit fee. Only one. If you have 10 of these, you only pay one fee. But so you're first of all, you're imposing a fee on a right that's constitutionally accepted, and number two, you're creating a registry of firearms. So the law says
you can't do. I see what you're saying. You're right.
Right. So when I asked Secretary of State Amori about that, he said, "Well, I'm pretty sure that'll be stricken. You know, it's going to be amended." Well, the question is, Representative Jason Knight, who we had on this program that I interviewed about this very subject, I asked him if a legislator or general officer who takes an oath to uphold the Constitution is presented with a bill that's passed that is identified as being unconstitutional, should he or she sign that bill or vote for it? And he gave a very vague answer, but he has actually come out on social media. Representative Knight said parts of this are unconstitutional.
Wow, wow. So we have to wrap it up.
We do.
Yes, we do.
Time flies.
Great way to end. I'm Darlene DeRezzo, and tonight in the guest seat we've had host Dick August. Thank you for watching. Have a good night.